So welcome. It is fantastic to have you here. So we worked on this for a while, emailed about it quite a bit, and kudos to Stephanie and Leonora for working on it and making it happen. And I got to tell you, I got to start this by noting that this is really a Bobby Kennedy American Spectator reunion, okay? And so our founder, R.M. Material Jr., who we heard from earlier, his memoir, How Do We Get Out of Here, these are actually the words of your dad. And I've got to read a little bit from this. I think you'll be really touched by this. This is page 1 of his memoir, literally page 1. On April 24th, 1968, Bobby Kennedy walked without a security detail through the kitchen of Los Angeles Ambassador Hotel. He addressed a full and rowdy house at Indiana University. That's where Bob was. That's where Volodymyr Plazinski was. It was toward the end of Indiana's Democratic presidential primary, in which he was competing with Senator Eugene McCarthy, and Indiana's governor. Surprising as it may sound, I, Bob Terrell, was the only person standing on stage behind him. Though I was then a very green editor of a new off-campus conservative magazine, The Alternative, which I edit today under the name of The American Spectator. There were plenty of Kennedy supporters in the room that day, yet I was the solitary figure standing behind the massive black curtains in the backdrop. There was no one else on stage, just me, R.M. Material Jr., behind the curtains. I was the lone figure behind him. There I stood as he mesmerized yet another audience in his increasingly frenzied campaign for the Democratic presidential nomination. No one else was with us. I was 24 years old. And the truth be known, in April 1968, I already had my candidate. I was supporting Governor Ronald Reagan in their brief run for the Republican presidential nomination. I even had a Reagan for President button in my pocket. It's a little foreshadowing. Wearing a blue suit, as blue as the bluest sky. Look at this. You can't make this up, right? And rhythmically brushing a mop of brown hair from his brow, Bobby Kennedy answered questions from the audience, clasped hands from the outstretched arms, and then suddenly he stepped behind the curtain to leave, confronting me, and he asked, "How do we get out of here?" Well, I had no idea how to get out of here. I actually had no idea how I'd gotten here. He obviously thought I was his advance man. Presumably a car was waiting for him. My role as Bob Kennedy's newly appointed advance man was too good to pass up. So I was very professional, even a bit assertive. Fortunately, no one was coming forward to help, but the pressure was on me. He followed me through the curtains to the left. Then I sheepishly strode back through the curtains to the right. Then to the left, and then to the right again. There seemed to be a light to the left, an exit light. A car with its engine running was just beyond the light, outside the auditorium's rear door. The crowd was forming as I led Bobby Kennedy out into the street. I found the Kennedy car, at least I hoped it was a Kennedy car, and we hastened down the steps to it. He seated himself in the back seat and looked up at me, smiling. Then I suffered an inspiration. I took a Reagan for President button from my pocket and dropped it in his outstretched hand. He looked at it and laughed. Off his driver took him. I left Bob Kennedy laughing. So here we are, full circle, and I'm Bob Terrell's successor at American Spectator. You are very much your father's successor, very much so. And I want to start with this question. You've endorsed Donald Trump, and for that you've been denounced as a betrayer to your family's legacy, to your father, to your uncle, John F. Kennedy, your grandfather, right, the senior Joe Kennedy. But like you, I mean, I've followed the Kennedy family for a long time. I've written quite a bit about it, and you obviously know more about them than I do. But your father was very independent. I mean, he worked for Joe McCarthy. He and his brother and your grandfather endorsed Richard Nixon against Helen Gahagan Douglas in the Senate run in the 1950s. Your father endorsed Ike against Adlai Stevenson. So I see you as very much a maverick, an independent, upholding your father's legacy. Thoughts on that? I've said too much.
Well, yeah, I mean, I haven't thought a lot about that, but my uncle, Joe Kennedy, who died in World War II and was kind of the golden child of the family.
Right.
He spoke at the Democratic Convention in 1940, and he endorsed Farley. He endorsed Farley against Roosevelt. My grandfather in 1932 had been Roosevelt's treasurer. So our family, and then Roosevelt had appointed my grandfather to be the first head of the SEC, and then later the ambassador to the Court of St. James, and they had a close relationship for a while. And then my uncle, my father ran against a sitting Democratic president of the United States, Lyndon Johnson. He did not get the liberal support. The liberals went to Gene McCarthy. And all liberal institutions, the New York Times, the Democratic clubs, the Village Voice, most of Hollywood, Paul Newman, who later became a good friend with my dad, but they were all on the side of McCarthy. And my Uncle Ted ran against Carter in 1980.
Right.
So I guess, there is a tradition in my family of challenging the Democratic infrastructure. But I would say the larger issue is, at the Democratic Party that I grew up with, I believe if you went took a list of all the policy priorities of my uncle, John Kennedy, and my father, that I would check every box.
Yeah.
And the Democratic Party, when I was a kid, was the party of peace. My uncle John Kennedy was asked, his best friend, Ben Bradley, one of his two best friends, Ben Bradley, who was then the managing editor of the Washington Post, what do you want on your gravestone? And he said he kept the peace. He said that the primary job of a president of the United States is to keep the country out of war. He wasn't ever an isolationist, but he wanted to project economic power abroad, like Rand Paul just said, who's one of my heroes, by the way. Instead of... And Rand Paul was a hero of mine long before I defected from the from the Democratic Party. He said he didn't want children in Africa and Asia and Latin America, when they heard about the United States of America, to think of a man with a gun. He wanted them to think of a Peace Corps volunteer. He wanted them to think of the Kennedy Milk Program, which provided nutrition to tens of millions of children around the world, USAID, which at that time my uncle had started. It's now become a front for the CIA and regime change. But when my uncle started it, he started that and the Alliance for Progress to put America on the side of the poor and to end run military juntas and the oligarchs who were the traditional targets of U.S. aid, to grow the middle class in those countries and create markets around the world for the United States in a way, like Rand Paul said, trade is what makes everybody wealthy. My uncle, 3 days before my uncle took the oath of office, and I watched his inauguration from the front row. Dwight Eisenhower made probably the most important speech in American history in retrospect today, warning America against the emergence of military-industrial complex that would subvert all the values and all the institutions of democracy. My uncle took that to heart. He spent his 1,000 days in office battling against his own military-industrial complex, the intelligence apparatus, the military brass who wanted a war with the Soviet Union. They tried to get him to go into Laos in '61. He refused. To Cuba in '61. To Germany, Checkpoint Charlie crisis in '62. To Cuba again in '63, and to Vietnam, and he refused. He never sent a combat troop to Vietnam. And in fact, he did end up, they wanted 250,000 combat troops. He ended up sending 16,000 military advisors, which was fewer than the number of U.S. soldiers that he sent to get James Meredith, one black man, into the University of Mississippi.
Wow.
And on October 22nd of 1962, he learned that they weren't, under his rules of engagement, allowed to participate in combat. They were advisors, helicopter pilots. But he learned on October 22nd, 1963, that a Green Beret had died. And he asked Walt Rostow, who was one of his aides, for a casualty list. And Walt Rostow came back and said 75 Americans have died. And he said, that's too many.
Oof.
And that afternoon, he signed National Security Order 263, ordering all U.S. personnel home from Vietnam by 1965, with the first 1,000 coming home in December, which was 6 weeks later. 30 days after he signed that order, he was killed. And a week after that, LBJ remanded that order and then sent 250,000 troops. My father ran against that war because that was what the Democratic Party was supposed to be doing. And he died in that process. Nixon was elected, sent 560,000 troops home. 56,000 never came home, including my cousin George Skakel. But this was the ideology, the central plank of the Democratic Party. We were the party of peace. Today, the Democratic Party is the party of war. You see 51 CIA officers endorsed Kamala Harris this week. Extraordinary. She had a deputy director of the CIA precede her immediately before she went onto the stand in the Democratic Convention and delivered this speech of extraordinary belligerence and, about talking about the American empire and our duty to police the world. It was right out of the neocon lexicons. She has boasted in recent days of the endorsements by Dick Cheney, by John Bolton, and 225 other neocons who've come out publicly. These are the people who brought us the Patriot Act. They brought us the torture regime. They brought us the censorship state, the surveillance state. They brought us the Iraq War, which was the biggest foreign policy debacle in American history. Dick Cheney has not changed. He has not recanted. He still believes all those were great successes. So his endorsement of Kamala Harris indicates that the Democratic Party has changed altogether. My dad, my uncle, the Democratic Party, as Rand said, was traditionally the party of protecting the First Amendment, the cornerstone of all of our rights. A nation that can silence, a government that can silence its opponents has license for every atrocity. And they knew that, and the free flow of information is the sunlight, the soil, the water, the air, the fertilizer for democracy. If you strangle free speech, democracy also dies. Today, this party, and you look in the last week, Tim Walz, Kamala Harris, and Hillary Clinton have all made statements saying the First Amendment is essentially a privilege, not a right. And the government has an obligation to censor misinformation and disinformation. And in my case, I have an injunction right now against the White House, against the Biden administration for censoring my speech. Judge Doty, who wrote that decision, wrote a 155-page decision detailing how 37 hours after he took the oath of office, President Biden had people in his White House ordering by email, which we now have because of our discovery, ordering Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, Google to censor the speech of his opponents, not just on medical issues, but on Ukraine and other issues as well. It's extraordinary. And he opened up a portal. In fact, we have these extraordinary emails in which the officers of Facebook are talking to each other and saying this is illegal. What they're doing is utterly unethical. And they push back on the White House saying, because they dutifully removed my entire Instagram account, 1 million followers. They said, they pushed back and they said, not a single post that I had ever put up was false, was factually incorrect. Everything I ever put up, I sourced and cited to government databases or to peer-reviewed publications. Well, they said, well, some of this is not actually factually erroneous. And the White House had to devise a new term called malinformation, which is information that is factually correct, but nevertheless inconvenient for the government. Right. And they began censoring that, but President Biden opened up a portal that was run by the FBI. And the FBI then invited all these other agencies, the CIA, the DHS, NIH, FDA, CDC, and the IRS. I don't know why they wanted to censor people, but also CISA. CISA is this very sinister agency that is at the center of the censorship industrial complex to censor speech of Americans. And anybody who knows that the idea that the First Amendment, this is what Democrats actually believe today, that the First Amendment does not protect misinformation and disinformation. The First Amendment protects all speech. It never makes a determination about whether something is a lie or the truth. It protects lies. It was written not to protect the speech that we consider convenient and we agree with. That is friendly to all of our attitudes. It was written specifically to protect the speech that nobody wants to hear.
So what do you do? And Rand alluded to this as well, or mentioned it directly. Like when you Google your name, it pops up, right? Robert F. Kennedy Jr., anti-vaccine conspiracy theorist, peddling misinformation, disinformation. Who writes that? and where do you even go to say, what 21-year-old twit, posted this, and what are they citing? What did Peter McCullough, others have said this? What's my misinformation?
Yeah, well, that's what I've always said. Show me where I got it wrong.
Right.
Because you know what I would do if I got something wrong? I would correct it.
Yeah.
So just show me the fact.
You're human.
And that's what I said repeatedly to Instagram when they took me down. I said, show me one thing I got wrong that you think I got wrong, and they would not do it.
And if you go and try to edit the Wikipedia page or whatever.
Mine is one of, I think, 2 pages that is frozen, that cannot be edited.
Amazing. Well, it's frozen out. You can't even touch it. You can't even correct it.
No.
So the misinformation, you don't even know what the misinformation is. So it's kind of, and I guess that would be the private sector, right? So somebody there is controlling that, I suppose, at Wikipedia or Google.
Wikipedia is sui generis. It's run by a private foundation, but it's actually controlled by the intelligence agencies, the pharmaceutical companies, and there's been really great literature on that and documentation on that by a guy called Gary Null, and who has litigated against them because they went after him. But if you look at Wikipedia, any product, for example, natural health products, nutrition products, vitamins, is disparaged on it. Any doctor who's famous as a functional health doctor, an integrated medicine doctor, alternative medicine,
right,
outside of the sort of Flexner study paradigm, those people are all defamed. And
it's like crackpots, right? Isn't it amazing how, like, with COVID, they started putting natural immunity in quotes, right? like that was some kind of a made-up thing, right? Rand and I were talking about that. So if you got COVID, well, you actually got natural immunity, right? But they're making fun.
I'll tell you something that interesting that happened today, and I actually was going to mention this to Rand, because it was an extraordinary event to me. But Robert Redfield, who I really go after in my Fauci book, kind of a hammer and tongs, wrote an editorial in Newsweek magazine today saying that he was endorsing President Trump because President Trump was going to restore American health, and that President Trump, he said, a lot of people might surprise me to see this, but hear me say this, but he has chosen exactly the only person who can do this, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. This was breathtaking to me because this is the guy who's the head of the CDC that I've been criticizing for years. And then this afternoon, he came over and had lunch with me. It's the first time I've ever met him. And the first thing he said to me is, "You got everything right."
Wow.
Oh, it was,
Wow. I think we'll probably come back to that point, but you also mentioned there democracy, right? So these folks claim to be great proponents of democracy. You pointed out that the convention, the Democratic convention, I mean, when Biden withdrew, and people ask me as a political science professor, so what will happen? Biden got all the delegates, and now what will happen to the Democratic convention? And I'll say, well, this is going to be really interesting this year, right? Well, you'll have, it'll be a truly open convention. You'll probably have Gavin Newsom, Gretchen Whitmer, Kamala Harris. Nobody likes her, so, they probably won't. But this will be, old smoke-filled room, mainly. They'll come together. But instead, they just did this, anointing with, could you imagine this in your Father's Day? Or your Uncle's Day?
It was like a palace coup. The best part, my favorite part of the convention, the televised part, I wasn't there, of course, was when Chris Cuomo points up at the upper deck of the stadium, of the arena, and he said, those up there, those are all the $2 million boxes.
Yeah.
He said, we don't even know who's up there. These are the people who created Kamala Harris and it's BlackRock and it's, all of the
Right,
biggest donors to the Democratic Party.
It's not the working class.
It's not, and that's the other thing, is that this weird inversion has taken place. And I could go through a much longer list, but one of the really interesting things, the Democratic Party that I grew up with was the party of labor unions. It was the party of the cops, the firefighters, Main Street shopkeepers, et cetera. It was very, very interesting that Sean O'Brien, who I love and who's a great friend, who's the head of the Teamsters Union, spoke at the Republican convention for the first time. And then if you look at in 2020, roughly 50% of the people in this country voted for Biden, and roughly 50% voted for Trump. The 50% who voted for Biden own 70% of the wealth in this country. The 50% who voted for Trump own 30%. So literally, and if you look at fundraising, which I was doing a couple days ago, comparing the Republican and Democratic fundraising, the Democrats are raising 2 or 3 times what the Republicans are. And this is an inversion of what the Democratic Party I grew up with. The Democratic Party I grew up with was the party of the poor. Today, it's the party of the rich. It's the party of the billionaires, a big tech, big pharma, big ag, big food, big Wall Street, and the military-industrial complex. Charlie Kirk said to me, and the Republican Party in 2020 had only 30% of the wealth. So it really has become the party of the poor. This extraordinary inversion has taken place. Charlie Kirk said to me, Donald Trump chased all the billionaires out of the Republican Party. It was really, an incredible observation by somebody who's been kind of the heart of very conservative doctrine for a long time.
Yeah, my Italian Catholic grandmother had a picture of Jesus, the Pope, and JFK. That was her, my dad called it her Holy Trinity. But they also tried to keep you off the ballot state after state, right? These great proponents of democracy, right? Suing you to keep your name off the ballot.
They're telling people that Donald Trump is going to end democracy. Right. But Donald Trump actually won an election. He won the primaries, 3 times, and he ran fair and square. And all of my polling from day one was showing that about 57% of the people who were supporting me, if I left the race, they would support Trump. So I was bad for Trump from the outset, but Trump did nothing to try to get me out of the race. Yeah. The Democrats spent tens of millions of dollars not only defaming me and making me look like a crazy person, but then they ended the primaries. They would not let me run against them. They literally canceled the primaries. So they felt that they had to destroy democracy in order to save it from Donald Trump. And it's no longer there was an interesting, and I couldn't get on the media. So when Ross Perot ran in 1992, he had 34 interviews on ABC, NBC, CBS, and CNN. And if you remember back then, he seemed to be almost every week on Larry King.
Right.
So they were interviewing him. I got in, and he was only running for 10 months. I was running for 18 months. And during that period, I had 2 live interviews on all of the networks except for Fox. So and then about, I don't know, I think it was August or September, early September, President Putin ran his election in Russia, and President Biden and Vice President Harris were deriding him because he won 88% of the vote, and they said, well, that's because he got rid of all of his opponents and he controls the media. And I was like, well, it's this extraordinary incapacity at any kind of sort of self-analysis or self-examination.
Well, and now they're trying to, when you've asked to remove your name from the ballot in certain states, they're filing lawsuits to get it back on.
Yeah, they pivoted.
Right.
They pivoted overnight. Yeah. So they were suing me in about 15 states. I've already spent over $10 million trying to get on the ballot, and then I succeeded in getting on the ballot in every state. New York, I've now been thrown off. I'm in the Supreme Court now, trying to get on in New York just for principal reasons, because New York has this law that would hurt any independent candidate who ever runs again. So we're suing with the approval and the support of the Trump administration to get me on a ballot which is going to hurt Trump. But he's doing it because of the principle. And but with a number of those states, like North Carolina, I think Iowa, Michigan, many other states, Pennsylvania, I was trying to remove my name from those ballots, from all of the battleground state ballots. And overnight, they pivoted from litigating against me to keep me off those ballots to litigating against me to keep me on the ballots.
Right, right. So and in the swing states, you've said you want people to vote for Trump in those swing states.
Yeah.
And I think the most egregious thing that they did was denying you Secret Service protection. And this was a law, a practice begun with the assassination of your father in June 1968. And you had security threats against you. You had someone walk into your house in LA, right? I mean.
Yeah, when you were reading from Emmett's book, it said my father walked into the hallway with no protection.
Yeah.
And so Secret Service protection was not available at that time until after the conventions, and only to the party candidates. When my father was shot in June 5th of 68, the White House immediately provided Secret Service protection to all candidates. You know, George Wallace, Eugene McCarthy, Hubert Humphrey, everybody got it suddenly. And then Congress changed the rule to make it so that if you met certain metrics, you could get it. Well, I met those metrics.
Totally.
And I was the first candidate in history that requested Secret Service protection and didn't get it. Wow. And I was getting, very, very serious threats. I had a guy show up at a rally that I did in Los Angeles, and he identified himself as a U.S. Marshal. He had a U.S. Marshal badge. He had federal ID on his belt. And
weapons.
What?
And weapons.
Well, we later found out my security team looked at his badge, and this is Gavin DeBecker's, private security team, which I think is the best in the world, and they saw that his badge was a little bit shiny, and they thought something's wrong. So they detained him. They found 2 shoulder holsters fully loaded with magazines. They took his backpack, which had knives, a number of other guns, including a laser-guided pistol, a lot of spare magazines. And otherwise, if they hadn't noticed that, he would have been escorted to the green room where I was at that time. So, and then that guy, before he left home, he recorded his first Instagram posting. And it was a posting that said, I'm on a mission, I may not come back alive, and, if I don't come back, everybody report to your commander-in-chief. So it was not, and I had 4 break-ins at my house. One of them got to the 2nd floor with my family home. So, we had 68 pages that we provided the Secret Service of threats and attacks to me, against me, and we made 6 separate requests, and each time they refused. And they clearly were doing it because the agency was politicized. And they were trying to, they knew that I was spending a lot of money. We were spending $1 million a month on security, and they knew that this was a way to bleed me dry. As an independent candidate, if you are a Republican or Democrat, you can collect individual donations, maximum donations of $750,000 per donor. Independent candidates can only get $6,600 per donor. So we had financial constraints from the beginning. We were raising even more money than them in many cases, but they had these huge donors, and we did, and we had to spend most of that money on ballot access and on Secret Service, or on security.
You know, so I interviewed you about this, and you told me at the time, this is very prescient considering what happened in Butler, Pennsylvania. By the way, it's my hometown, Butler, Pennsylvania. Do you believe that? I was Butler High School class of 1984. We're now infamous. But you told me, you said, I don't spend time worrying about my personal safety. I do worry about the safety of my family and their sense of well-being, and about the safety of bystanders at a rally, right? If there is a more serious incident. And of course, that's exactly what happened to Donald Trump in Butler. This poor soul, Corey Comparatori, died.
A firefighter. I talked to his wife afterward.
Wow. And now, is it true that you finally
But,
got
you know,
Secret Service protection only after that?
I got it for a month, and then when I endorsed Trump, they took it away.
Oh, well, I didn't know that.
Yeah, so, but in most of the attempted assassinations of presidential candidates, there have been bystanders injured. When my uncle was shot, John Conley, of course, got shot. When Reagan was shot, you had Jim Brady and a number of other people wounded. When my father was shot, there were 6 bystanders shot that night, including Paul Schrade, one of his best friends who took a bullet to his head. So, you know, so that was something that worried me. And Paul was a very good friend of mine. He died a year and a half ago, and he was very, very close to me. So I was very conscious of the fact that, you know, other people are at risk. When I go into a room, other people are at risk.
Oh, wow. So now I got to be mindful of the clock, right, Grover? But this is going so good, I really don't want to stop.
You choose, we're all set.
All right, okay. We said 20 to 25 minutes. So now, I mean, speaking of Ronald Reagan, I'm a Reagan biographer, and Ronald Reagan famously said, I didn't leave the Democratic Party left me. And you said a few weeks ago, I left the party, quote, and most sadly for me, for the Democratic Party, in the name of saving democracy, the Democratic Party set itself to dismantling it, lacking confidence in its candidate that its candidate could win in a fair election at the voting booth. But do you feel now that the party has left you, right?
Yeah, and if you think about it, the best strategy, if they wanted to win, was to have an open primary. Our polls and every poll attested me in a head-to-head race against Donald Trump. I won, and I won big by 14 points. I won in head-to-head race against President Biden. I won 32 states, and he won 18.
Mm-hmm. I saw some of that data. It's right,
11,
yeah. Michigan and others.
Yeah, I was winning all these states in a head-to-head race, but when you had 3 of us in, my numbers dropped way down because
Right.
people were voting out of fear of, you know, one of the other 2 candidates. But if you think about the Democratic Party, if they had just invited people, you know, like Gavin Newsom, a lot of people wanted to run. And if they had done that, they would have seen President Biden's disabilities much earlier, and they would have been able to switch out and make adjustments. But, you know, they did something. The thing about the Democratic Party, I think, is the key to understanding them. Other than they have no defense now, Democrats have no defense against propaganda. They just believe whatever the government tells them. Yeah. The Democratic Party has become the party of centralized control because they've lost faith in the people. They've lost faith in the demos. They do not believe that people can be provided, for example, information because the information may affect their beliefs.
Yeah.
And so the information given to them has to be controlled by the government. And elections have to be controlled from the top down, from those top bleachers in the arena. And it's all about, very, very centralized control, and all of these very, what I would call insidious relationships they now have, that all of their institutions have with the intelligence agencies.
So it may affect their beliefs about the party, and go against the party and hurt the party. It's really the party above all, right, that they're concerned about.
Well, I mean, we don't even know how Kamala Harris got elected.
Right, right.
Who decided that?
Yeah. I mean, really, what should have happened at that convention? I mean, it should have been an open debate, right? Different candidates. I mean, she had no votes. She had no primary votes.
Yeah.
And I read this week.
I mean, there was a lot of imaginative after the debate, that first debate with President Trump, when it became clear to everybody that he was severely disabled, he was cognitively, these cognitive deficiencies.
Yeah.
And everybody kind of agreed he had to go. They still had about a month. And there was talk about holding mini primaries, about somehow injecting democracy into the process. But in the end, they just said, the hell with it. We're just going to do what we want to do. And then the extraordinary thing happened. You had this palace coup against Biden, and Kamala Harris, who could not even, when she ran in 2020, she was polling at 8% in her own state. She couldn't get dinner reservations, and nobody in the party liked her.
Yeah,
and then all of a sudden,
she was the least liked of all of them.
Right.
In 2020.
And then what happened? Suddenly, people were told, "Oh, she's wonderful." How do we know? She didn't do an interview for 35 days.
Not one.
So, but we were just told, this is wonderful, believe what we say, and people believed it. And as I said, there's no defense among my friends. I grew up with Democrats. My family is all Democrats. I talk to them. It's extraordinary because they have no defense against propaganda. If the government says something is true, they believe it's true. And if you commit the heresy of challenging it, you become a dangerous person. You become the heretic. You can't be debated. You have to be burned at the stake. You have to be silenced. And it's a kind of a religious affiliation. It's a tribal affiliation rather than what it used to be, which is this wonderful confluence of ethics and debate and conversation and dispute that we prided ourselves on as Democrats, that, in the free markets, we all recognize totalitarian systems have advantages over free markets because they're so efficient. You have one person making the decision, nobody questions it, it's immediately implemented. In a democratic system, it's very, very messy, but the framers understood that the advantage we have was that the ideas would be annealed in the furnace of debate, and that they would rise in the marketplace of ideas, and theoretically the best policies would rise to the top of the pile, and that's how we would get policies that were the product of some kind of consensus, and people would be peaceful about their democracy because they could understand that, and also you would get the best policies. And I think that worked for a long, long time in American history, but we no longer really have democracy in this country.
And they talk about unity. Did Kamala Harris reach out to you?
No, but after President Trump reached out to me, and I began these series of discussions with him, these extraordinary discussions, really, because he was a completely different person than the person that he's been portrayed. And I've known Donald Trump
Bob Carroll always says, yeah.
And, I've been subjected to the same defamations and perjuries, et cetera, so I also understand that in person, you could be a completely different person than you're portrayed. Right. But there's no questioning that's part of this gullibility among Democrats now. They believe whatever CNN tells them. But I had these really revelatory, and I've known Donald Trump for probably 35 years. I've sued him twice and won both lawsuits. And I actually, during one of the times, I was suing him against a stop at golf course that he was putting up in the New York City reservoir system. And we didn't want the golf course putting pesticides into the reservoir. And I was suing him. And my wife wanted to go to Florida for the weekend with her kids and to visit my mother over Easter. And I said, well, I don't want to pay for tickets. And she said, what if I can get a free ride? I said, okay, if you can do that. She called me a couple days later and said, I got a ride. And I said, from who? And she said, from Donald Trump. And I said, I'm suing him. And she said, he knows, but he doesn't care. And so I did get that side of his personality, that he was, he could fight you, but still kind of enjoy you.
Right, yeah, and be friends.
But I had these discussions with him for a while, and, it began to see that on the issues that he was very enthusiastic about, including the issues. He had two issues, really, the economy and the border. And I brought him these other issues, which was ending the war in Ukraine immediately, ending the censorship, surveillance, and then the making America healthy again.
So not MAGA, but MAHA, right? Yeah, making America healthy again.
On all of those, he was, number one, conversant and agreeing with me, but also very enthusiastic about, let's make that part of the campaign. We'll have a unity party. We'll join up, and we'll make those sort of a joint platform of both your party and my party. So I was talking to him about that, but I said I should call Harris and see if she, is interested. So I still have friends in the Democratic Party. And,
maybe.
Yeah. And I called a number of them and said, can you see if she'll take a meeting with me? And they talked to her directly, and she said, no way.
Wow.
So,
Wow. That's very revealing. All right, last question, only because we're up against the clock. If Donald Trump were to win and there's another Trump administration, what would you like to do in that administration?
I think I would like kind of a roving portfolio to unravel corruption in various agencies, including my daughter-in-law is here today, who ran my campaign, Amaryllis Fox, who joined the CIA after 9/11 and served in the clandestine services for 10 years in the Mideast, and is the smartest person I've ever met. And we are now part of the transition team. So, and by the way, President Trump has kept every promise that he's made to me. He said, we're going to put you, I didn't ask to be on the transition team. He said, I want you on the transition team. Wow. I asked him, I said, I would strongly recommend you bring Tulsi in too. And he said, I'm going to do that. And then he, and sure, to his word, he has done those things, but he also, people were saying to me, oh, you can't trust this guy. He's going to say anything you want, and then he's going to double-cross you, and you need to get a contract with him. And so I, of course, didn't do that because it's illegal. But also, it was weird. But what he did is he's gone out with all of those issues and made them the centerpiece of almost every speech that he gives.
Yeah, right.
And that's the best contract that I can have.
Yeah.
He's told the public, this is what I'm going to do. This is what it means to elect Donald Trump. We're going to end the Ukraine war on day one. We're going to have, he's a deal maker, and he sees the waste of war. And he said, we're going to have peaceful competition with China, peaceful competition with Russia. They have resources. They have all these things that we can take advantage of. He said that, he's made Make America Health Again part of his platform. And he's been very vocal about ending the censorship. So all the things that I've asked him to do, he, without me asking him, has gone out and publicly said, this is who I am. This is what it means to elect me as president.
Right. Well, we're gonna stop there. I feel like I could talk to you for hours, but God bless you. You're truly your Father's son, and thank you for all that you're doing. And, right, everybody, thank you very much.
Yeah, fantastic.